Hey folks, Marco here. Today we will be making our own custom node because it is surprisingly easy. You will make initialization file whose sole presence, even if empty, tells the rest of the code that you are a Python package. You can add something like hello world into it and it will show up when you turn on Comfy UI. We will continue on from there, and then by the end of the lecture you will create your very own node. You will learn how to add basic input to it, how to set up the output, and how to program Node's internal logic. Since we are learning by internal logic for us today, just means to assign input to output, and once input and output are internally connected, the node should be able to work within a basic workflow without errors. If you've never heard of the words Comfy or Python or Stable Diffusion, I have otherwise no idea what I'm talking about. This video is about generative AI. So Comfy UI is a modular graphical user interface for running Stable Diffusion, and this is what it looks like. So as we pick through the inner workings of Comfy, this is, I believe, a good learning opportunity. Python is a powerful high-level programming language that powers Comfy and is a very useful skill to have, valued by employers. So we will learn about how package gets imported, the terminal output data structures in Python, and ultimately, by the end of today, you will learn how to put together a simple node. So that's essentially the agenda for today. So to set things up, obviously, you're going to need to install Comfy as you normally would. You may want to have a separate installation just in case, or at least back up your existing one. The only new thing I think you may need to install is Visual Studio Code. Its download page looks like this, and once you download it, just follow the prompts and use recommended settings. Maybe I tick these two boxes. By default, they are unticked, so I just did that for convenience, but it's up to you. So once you've done all that, you right-click where you want Comfy UI to be, and you open the terminal, git clone, so just as you normally would, and the same for the manager. And that's it. So I am sharing with you my workspace file for Visual Studio Code, which has all my settings. So you can use it. Just drop it in the Comfy UI folder and double click to open program. And this is what you should see. So this is how we'll know, I guess, if we're on the same page. When you right click on the main.py, what should happen is, and when you run the Python in the terminal, you should be able to see that same familiar Comfy UI launch sequence of everything that everything that you normally would see when you run it, whatever it is that you normally run it as. I don't use Venv. I use Anaconda as an environment, so I'll also share my setup files there. So if that helps, but anyway. Assuming you've set all that up, you have opened Visual Studio Code, you have opened Comfy. This is what you see in front of you. To your left is where the directories are. You right-click on custom nodes, you click on new folder, and you give that folder a name. If you're not sure about the name, it's probably best if you follow what other developers are doing and just copy their system. At this level, we have upper and lower letters. I mean, by level, I mean at this level in the folder hierarchy. As you can see, words are mostly separated by hyphens here. However, if you look at the lower levels, files and folders below tend to use mostly underscores instead. As it turns out, Python doesn't like hyphens very much. So if in doubt, see what others are doing and use underscores if you want to play it safe, or otherwise just avoid underscores and hyphens altogether. But anyway, you right-click on it, you on the folder that you've created, and you click to create a new file, and you give that file a name, init.py. Now have a closer look at how this file is named. So init is preceded and superseded with 2 underscores followed by extension .py. This is important. So which I will explain in a moment, but inside this file, as the tradition dictates, we write hello world. And once you've done that, you can right click on the file and run it just to make sure that it works. So if all goes well, you should see hello world in your terminal. I guess this is your first sort of a self-test to make sure all is configured well. If you see hello world, well done. If you don't, do not despair. So depending on the type of error you get, but I suspect, I guess my suggestion first is to check the environment is actually active. You will find it on the left-hand side. So make sure you have correctly activated your workspace environment there, whether it's Venv or Conda or whatever it is that you're using. So this file you created initializes your code as a package. And in truth, this happens even if you were to leave it empty. But hello world on the screen doesn't just turn up when you run the file. It actually shows up when you turn on Comfy as well. So you can try it. You'll see that it'll come up in the among all those lines of the usual lines in the terminals that you see when when it runs. But then look at what other devs can do. Can we do that? Of course we can. We can use something called ANSI control sequences. Essentially what it is it's a code that controls text output. For example, you can add these 2 lines before and after hello world. And on closer inspection, you will notice that there is a pattern. It starts with a backslash followed by 3 numbers and this open square bracket. And the sequence ends with M and the number 35, which is in this case sandwich kind of in between, and also in this case specifies a color, purple. I am leaving these scary sounding words in my slides just in case any of you want to look it up further, but the gist of it is really simple. So the first line basically says, make my font purple. The second line says, print a message. And the third one says, reset all parameters. You need this last bit because otherwise you would just, everything beyond your hello world will just color purple. So yeah, try running Comfy's main.py and see, you should be able to see hello world turn on terminal during the loading of the program. So it should look like this. So now that we have registered our code as a package, we can look at what a typical code for a node looks like, what needs to be included there. So we begin by creating a folder, which I will call modules. You can call it anything you want. And in that folder, create a file with .py extension, which will contain the code for our node. So let's take a simple example. I'm going to use cliptext encode node I'm sure everyone's familiar with. Each node has 3 parts. So input, I notice that this includes the widget as well. Under the hood, they're both inputs. Then we have output here. So this is conditioning. And lastly, we have internal function of sort that will perform the main task we want this node to do. So following the example, let's put together a skeleton, or in other words, the bare minimum needed for our node to render on the workspace. Notice how the code begins with the word class. Under the hood, each node in Comfy is an entity called class. A class basically serves as a blueprint for creating objects, and they are important not only to Python, but also in many other object-oriented programming languages. So underneath this first line, we have the node input. Then we have the output and the node's internal function, which I have labeled do nothing. So let's try to import this node into the workspace, because just having it there sitting, it's not gonna work. We actually, it needs to be imported. So in order to do that, we basically need to go back to that init file we created prior and use the words from and import in a manner shown here. Notice how the nothing node is slightly faded green compared to the green to its left. That is one of the cool things about the Visual Studio Code. I guess it's ecosystem of extensions, and it's not just it's not like a text editor or anything like that. It can spot many of our mistakes, and in this case, when you hover a mouse over it, it will say that the imported class is not being accessed. So in other words, hey, I can see you made this import, but you're not using it. Anyway, so we will then type in all caps node class mappings. You put your cursor right in between the two braces, and then when you click enter, when you type enter, braces will separate exactly as they should be in order to make your code readable. And then you type the following two words: node, so nothing node in quotation marks, and nothing node, one word, separated by a colon. And notice how the faded value of nothing node has now gone full green. That's because we're actually referencing it. So now you hit save, and your formatter will move things around, and you should have this now. Launch, so then you launch your Comfy UI, and then when you right-click on the workspace, your function will be located under SD. You click there, you click on the node name, and hopefully you should get nothing node render on workspace. Great success. But hold on, Marco, I can already hear you say, you haven't explained this bit. You can't just expect us to blindly follow this like a recipe because you said so. And you're right, my apologies. After all, we are learning science. This is machine learning, not baking a cake. Nothing remotely like baking a cake. So what you see before you is something called a dictionary, which is essentially, it's a kind of a data structure made up of key value pairs. So keys are on the left-hand side, and they must be unique. Values are on the right-hand side, and neither keys nor values have to be strings. They are here in this example, but they don't have to be. In principle, you can have any data type. For example, here you can have a plain text, you can have a whole number, it can be a decimal number, or here is a dictionary. So that's right. So value assigned to a key can be a whole new dictionary as well. So if anyone's interested, I know that WAS Suite has several nodes that manipulate dictionaries. I haven't used these, but feel free to check these out if you want to play around with these things. But now, I didn't spend all this time explaining dictionaries just because they appear in node class mappings. You need to understand dictionaries in order to correctly set up node inputs. You see, node inputs are dictionaries as well. In fact, the entire input is basically a nested dictionary structure. At the highest level, there are one of these three string keys: required, optional, and hidden. So your inputs need to be assigned to they need to essentially be assigned to one or more of these. For purposes of importing our image, let's just use required here. Oh, and by the way, this comma here is not a typo. This, even though it's located in this unusual location. So everyone's familiar with the notion of sets in basic maths. Tuples are essentially sets where you cannot change the order of elements. Consider, for example, ordered pair. In general, you can't just swap width and height of the image, right? In general, unless it's a square or whatever. But so the order matters. And the same can be said for a triplet. If you're a digital artist, think of these as R, G, and B channels of an image. In four, if you add alpha channel to it, you get a quadruple. Then you have a quintuple, a sextuple, septuple, octuple, and so on and so forth. What happens when a mathematician runs out of words of Latin or Greek origin? They just slam the letter N to it and just say it's too many, N tuple. The interesting thing is N can be any non-negative number. So you can have one tuple as well, which is what we have here. So it's a set with one, ordered set with one element there. So, and this comma character has to be there, I guess, for technical reasons. If it wasn't there, Python interpreter may think something else of it, about these round braces. You might think that these round brackets are there for, I don't know, to separate blocks of code or maybe some other reason. So it has to be there. So we'll go ahead, we test to see if this now works. When you click on your node, and hopefully you should see input turn up there. All that's left is now to handle the output and processing. So these fields here, the return types, function, and the actual definition of a function underneath is where we process the inputs and set up our outputs. So the complete node should look something like this. So what you see here is image, the input, right, gets assigned to a new variable, output img, and then we're returning that output as a tuple. The other thing you will note is, so there's a few things that you need to be aware when doing this, is the input that you've set up here. So the name of the string image has to match exactly with the argument you have here in the function. By the way, I keep calling this function. Strictly speaking, this is actually a method. So this is just me being loose with the terminology. The other thing is, if you set this return types, if you declare them to be tuple that is that has image there, then you have to make sure that your output really is what you're claiming it to be over here, that the types are actually matching. And lastly, you'll see this category bit. So if you wonder why did your node end up when you right click, why is it in the SD menu? It's essentially, it's like a backup. So Comfy UI, or maybe it's the manager, I don't know. If you don't declare set up the category, what it does automatically is it assigns it to that folder. It gives you the category as by default somewhere in the code, I suspect. But you should specify, give it whatever name you want to give it, and so that then that's where the node will be. Our imports are already sorted. This has already been configured. However, I just want to show you one more thing. Node class mappings. I haven't specified this explicitly, but this word nothing node actually has to be unique globally. So you can't have another node have this string there. It doesn't matter when it's something like nothing node, because who else would name their node nothing node? But if you've built your own, say, LoRa loader or something like that, it's you got to be careful, because when I'm sure from experience, when you type the word LoRa loader or load LoRa, you end up with, depending on what you have installed, you might have 3 or 4 different nodes come up across from different packages doing essentially the same function of loading LoRa's. So yeah, this has to be globally unique. But in order to distinguish your node from others, which can be handy sometimes for something like that's common, like LoRa loaders, you can like assign, I don't know, you can put like a little character, or you can do, I think Blender Neko finds, he puts his initial B and K, so it's actually easy as well for searching. Or otherwise you can, I guess, put emoji or whatever. I mean, I'm just sort of explaining this under the assumption that you're not actually publishing anything. This is just like for your own amusement. I don't actually know what the rules are if you want to make a repository and release your node to others. All right, so you click on Lich Nodes, you click on Nothing Node, which now look different. And here we go. Of course, just because node renders, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to work. So we need to put that into a workflow just to make sure that it's actually working. And from what I can see here, it is. So some more things that can possibly, I guess, go wrong. Function can only process input if its argument matches the key string exactly. So this is a repeat of what I said before, but it's good that I'm putting it in writing as well, just so you have it when you download the PowerPoints. So our node was in SD subdirectory before. So to change the directory, context menu, I guess, assign some string to a category. And once you do, it'll show up from the context menu. And the other thing is return value must be of the type declared under return types. So let me say this again. So return value must be of type declared under return types. Okay. And lastly, indentation matters. So I think one of the unique things about Python is, indentation is actually, it's very important. Like it's used to separate blocks of code. In other languages, you might use, like, say, I know JavaScript uses curly braces, or when you begin your if loops, for loops, and all that. If branches and for loops and so on, and it's blocks of code are separated with braces. In other languages might be different kind of brace, but yeah, in Python it's done through indentation. I guess visually it makes it look more human friendly and readable. The other thing is it uses, I think the convention is, my understanding is that you're supposed to use spaces, not tabs. So by default, I think when you install Visual Studio Code, it'll type 4 spaces for each tab. And just to be clear, you can use tab key on your keyboard, but what I'm saying is your IDE is automatically going to interpret that as not as, oh, I'm putting tab character there, as it might do in Notepad or other software, but it's actually going to put space characters. So what did we learn today? Comfy UI is graph-based GUI for Stable Diffusion, but you knew that already, right? Terminal text can be styled using these ANSI control sequences. We've seen about module initialization and the purpose of init file. Programmatically, we've seen that nodes are Python classes, and that they have 3 parts: the input, output, and a function. There could be other function there, but there's only one main sort of a function. I didn't want to call it main just to avoid confusion, but it's the one that's declared under function, the one written in all caps. Anyone want to know more or any further reading? This I recommend. I learned most of my stuff from here. And from studying the code of other developers. Your first assignment for this course is to design your own pipeline. You need to put together two nodes, one that packs your input into a lead and the other one that will unpack it. So these are the inputs you're supposed to take in, or outputs, I guess, depending on the node. Solution will be posted on GitHub. And just to give you an idea, what I mean is something like this. So obviously you can name it anything you want. I just lack imagination here. And I'll give you a hint. Have a look at the repository of Lieutenant Dr. Data. All right. Well, I shall leave you with that, and class dismissed.